Good afternoon, and thank you all for standing by. I'd like to inform all participants that your lines have been placed on the listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's call. This call is also being recorded. If anyone has any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to Ms. Lori Parton. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you. Welcome to the Children's Bureau's second webinar on the Comprehensive Child Welfare Information System Technical Bulletin Number 5, CCWIS Cost Allocation. The first webinar was on February 26th. If you missed the webinar, we will be posting it on the Children's Bureau website in two formats, as a video and also posting as a PDF of the PowerPoint with a transcript. We will also post this webinar in the same two formats once we have made them 508 compliant, so that both webinars are accessible to individuals with disabilities. Posting dates are to be determined and will be announced. On the control panel on the right side of your screen, you can download a copy of the technical bulletin as well as a copy of the slide deck we are using for this presentation. If you don't see the control panel, please click on the orange arrow to display it. We will pause to take questions during the webinar as well as to take time at the end to answer questions. At those times, we will open up the phone line to take questions. Or, if you prefer, you may type questions into the chat window in the control panel. During the presentation, if there are audio issues, please type the speaker name into the chat box and request additional volume. Next slide, please. As this presentation is a continuation of the first webinar, we have the same presenters and panel of experts. Our presenters include myself, Lori Parton from the Children's Bureau, Division of State Systems, David Baker, Contract Support for the Division, and Bill Meltzer from the Division of Program Implementation. Our experts to assist with questions are Terry Watt, the Director of the Division of State Systems, as well as fiscal and grants management experts Janice Davis-Caldwell, Cora Coleman, and Janet Turner. Next slide, please. Before we begin, we will review the scope of our two-part webinar series. As we did during the first webinar, we are, for the most part, using the generic term Cost Allocation Plan, or CAP, throughout the presentation rather than specific terms for different types of cost allocation plans. We are doing this because the principles being discussed are applicable to all of the different types of cost allocation plans, so it is easier to refer to them all with one term. But you may be more familiar with the other terms for CAP, such as the CAM, for Cost Allocation Methodology. This is the name of the plan that states submit to ACF, describing how they plan to allocate information systems development costs. A Public Assistance Cost Allocation Plan, or PACAP, is the state plan for allocating all state agency costs except for assistance or other payments for services and goods provided directly to program recipients. A PACAP, therefore, must identify the approved CAM for information system development costs and include a plan for allocating information system operational costs. The PACAP is submitted to Cost Allocation Services. Tribes also submit plans to ACF for allocating information system development costs through a CAM. However, tribes that directly operate Title 40 programs must also submit a Title 4E CAM to ACF that describes the tribal plan to allocate costs to 4E programs. The tribe's 4E CAM will therefore include reference to any approved CAM for information systems development costs and include a plan for allocating information system operational costs to Title 4E programs. And while 4E agencies submit their development CAM to ACF in their APD, the operational costs for the CCWIS project are included as a portion of the comprehensive PACAP that each agency prepares. In this webinar series, we are only focusing on the cost allocation rules that apply to CCWIS projects. Therefore, your agency will not follow the CCWIS rules when developing the other portions of their PACAP or operational CAM. We note that you may have more than one CCWIS project. If, for example, your agency uses a transitional CCWIS while a new CCWIS is under development, the agency will need to create cost allocation plans for both systems. So the steps we will go over in these two webinars will need to be repeated for each CCWIS project. Next slide, please. In this webinar, we will pick up the cost allocation example we began in the first webinar and take it through the remaining steps to illustrate how costs are allocated and reported. We will show how to use our completed automated function checklist to develop the CCWIS cost allocation plan for development costs. Once we have finalized the cost allocation plan, we will then move into applying the plan to project costs to determine the amount allocated to different programs. We will also circle back and review the CB 496 material we discussed 2 weeks ago. This will repeat some of the slides from the first webinar, but seeing it in context with the example will help clarify the use of the form. We will discuss some exceptions. These are costs that may, in certain circumstances, be exclusively allocated using CCWIS cost allocation approach rather than allocating some costs using a non-CCWIS cost allocation approach. We will highlight project events that will trigger the need to submit amendments to your cost allocation plan, as well as where agencies submit the different plans. Then, at the end, we will summarize the main points, provide a list of resources, and although we are pausing at several points to take questions, we will see if there are any remaining questions. We strongly encourage participants to ask questions. This will not only assist your state, but others with similar questions. Next slide, please. In the last webinar, we took our example to this point in the process, the completion of our automated function checklist. As you recall, we focused our analysis on the 10 automated functions listed here that make up our standalone CCWIS. When we finished, we determined that the 3 automated functions circled here, case management, licensing and placement, and the NIDed survey tool, would qualify for non-CCWIS cost allocation because they were either duplicated by another function, inconsistently used by workers, or both. The other 7, such as the intake and screening function and the court date exchange, are not duplicated and are consistently used by all workers and therefore qualify for CCWIS cost allocation. Next slide, please. Before we move to the next step of using the information in the automated function checklist as an input of the cost allocation plan, we want to graphically show the difference between the multiple program system and the standalone system. On the left is a multiple program system after the initial cost allocation has been completed and allocated benefits across 4 areas. But after this is finished, the agency will take that child welfare piece of the pie, in this example, the 35% slice on the upper right side of the pie, and conduct the analysis that involves the automated function checklist that we discussed on just that slice. The cost allocation plan resulting from the analysis we are about to do will apply to the 35% child welfare slice of the pie. It will not affect the cost allocation for the green and dark blue slices representing other programs. On the right is a pie representing a standalone system. If you have a standalone system where all of the benefits go to child welfare only, you don't have to do the initial cost allocation needed for a multiple program system. You start with the analysis of the automated functions. So for both multiple program systems and standalone systems, you do the same analysis that we are about to discuss. The difference is you will do additional steps first if it is a multiple program system to identify the slices, or rather the proportions that are assigned to each program. Next slide, please. This pie graphically displays the 10 functions from our automated function checklist that make up our CCWIS system. Once again, these 10 automated functions could be the 35% of the multiple program system or 100% of the standalone child welfare system. As a reminder, we determined that 7 of the functions are CCWIS automated functions, meaning they may qualify for CCWIS cost allocation. These are the ones in blue. The 3 slices in gray represent the 3 automated functions we determined would qualify for non-CCWIS cost allocation. This does not mean that 70% of the costs are allocated using a CCWIS cost allocation methodology and 30% are allocated using a non-CCWIS cost allocation. It could have taken more work and hence greater cost to develop one of the automated functions. Therefore, at this point, we need to quantify the amount of effort and hence the cost that it took to develop each of the 10 automated functions. Next slide, please. How do we quantify the work or level of effort? Agencies select a cost allocation base, which is how they will measure the level of effort to develop components of the system. Some examples of level of effort measures are the number of screens developed, the number of hours it took to develop a particular function, or the story points or requirements supported by the function, if the project management or software development approach is Agile-based. We remind participants that the base chosen must be related to systems work. Agencies propose the cost allocation base they will use, which is approved by the federal government. Note that you usually use different cost allocation bases for development activities and operations. For operations, utilize a cost allocation base that measures operational activities, such as processing time per component. Please note that these are examples of cost allocation bases. Agencies must develop their own reasonable, allowable, and allocable cost allocation basis for development and operations, and provide a business case explaining their choice in the process of applying to their development and operational activities. For more information, please see the Cost Allocation Methodology Toolkit, or CAM Toolkit. We have a link to the toolkit at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. For our example, we are using the number of screens in an automated function as our allocation base. We have selected a number of screens because it is quantifiable and commonly used. But we emphasize we are not endorsing number of screens as the development cost allocation base for your project. You will need to justify and document your allocation base. One other point. This cost allocation base is only applicable to information system development. The cost allocation base for your information system cannot be applied to other program costs, such as administrative costs and training costs. Agencies must propose a different and appropriate cost allocation base for those costs. Next slide, please. Now that we know how we are measuring the development level of effort, we count the number of screens the system is projected to have in each of the 10 automated functions to determine the proportion of costs allocated to the development of each automated function. If the number of screens changes over time, you would adjust the development cap. This simplified table shows that calculation. The first column lists the 10 functions by name to make it easier to distinguish the CCWIS automated functions from the non-CCWIS automated functions. We have noted the designation of each function as either CCWIS or non-CCWIS in the second column. We have also color-coded the rows, blue for CCWIS and gray for non-CCWIS functions. The third column is the number of screens the state expects to develop for that function. And the fourth column shows the percentage of development costs allocated to those functions. So reading the first line, we see that the intake and screening automated function is a CCWIS function with 10 screens or projected to have 10 screens. Since there are 100 screens in the total system, the module will cost 10% of the total CCWIS development cost. In the next screen, we will show the impact of this analysis upon the overall cost allocation. Next slide, please. Now you see the impact of our analysis upon the pie with the 10 automated functions. In this diagram, the size of each automated function reflects the level of effort we just calculated. The 7 CCWIS-eligible automated functions together represent 90% of the development effort, while the remaining 10% is allocated to the non-CCWIS functions. At this point, we are almost done with our analysis to determine our CCWIS development cost allocation. But there is one other thing to evaluate. Next slide, please. And that has to do with CCWIS support for juvenile justice and adult protective services. This is a slide from the first webinar that we used when discussing the CCWIS and non-CCWIS cost allocation rules. We have circled the bullet that indicates that cost to develop functions that benefit both 4E and either juvenile justice or adult protective services may be allocated to the 4E foster care program under the CCWIS development cost allocation approach. However, if there are portions of the system that only benefit juvenile justice or adult protective services, in other words, those portions do not benefit Title 4E eligible cases and services, those costs must be allocated to those programs and not to Title 4E. So we must separate out those costs as we develop our cost allocation plan. Next slide, please. Here's a table from our earlier analysis with a new line added in. This line represents the portion of the system that supports only the needs of either juvenile justice or adult protective services. You will see that neither CCWIS or non-CCWIS cost allocation applies to the 2 screens supporting these programs. Next slide, please. This represents 2% of the development system level of effort. Note that in our example, the juvenile justice and adult protective services screens are from 2 different automated functions, case management and reporting, so that reduces their level of effort by the same amount. Next slide, please. When we apply this analysis to our pie, our resulting cost allocation is as follows. 89% of the cost will use CCWIS cost allocation, 9% non-CCWIS, and 2% that will go to other non-Title 4E programs. Now we will show how to apply this cost allocation plan to the CCWIS development budget. Next slide, please. For our example, we are using a simplified budget listing the cost for the most recent quarter. To make it easy to follow the calculations, we are using a nice round number of $10 million. As you see from the first row of the table, we have brought forward the proportional allocations we arrived to on the previous screen. 89% that will be allocated according to CCWIS cost allocation, 9% allocated to non-CCWIS cost allocation, and 2% allocated to juvenile justice and adult protective services. Next slide, please. In the second row, we have determined the dollar amounts for each category. We do this by taking the allocated percentage for each category and multiplying it by the total development project cost for this quarter of $10 million. So, multiplying the percentage by the $10 million budget provides us our allocations by category. 89% times $10 million gives us $8.9 million that is allocated to CCWIS cost allocation, 9% or $900,000 that is allocated to non-CCWIS, and the remaining 2% or $200,000 to the juvenile justice or adult protective services programs. And then looking at the third row, we see the percentage of costs that are eligible for Title IV-E reimbursement. All of the costs, 100%, that qualify for CCWIS cost allocation are eligible. For our example, we have assumed that 60% of the children in our agency are Title IV-E eligible, so that percentage of the costs qualifying for non-CCWIS cost allocation are eligible. When you do this exercise for your agency, you would use the 4E participation rate for your agency here. And none, 0% of the unique JJ and adult protective services costs qualify for Title IV-E claims. These costs are allocated to those programs. Next slide, please. So for row 4, to determine the costs that are eligible for Title IV-E reimbursement, we multiply the percent eligible for Title IV-E by the allocated cost. For CCWIS, since all 100% of this cost pool is eligible, the total $8.9 million that is allocated to CCWIS is also eligible for Title IV-E reimbursement. However, for the costs that qualify for non-CCWIS cost allocation, only 60%, or $540,000, are eligible for reimbursement. And as we see, this is not applicable to the JJ and adult protective services costs, since none of the $200,000 is eligible for Title IV-E reimbursement. Next slide, please. In the last step, we determine the dollar amount of the Title IV-E reimbursement. We do this by taking the Title IV-E reimbursement rate and multiplying it by the Title IV-E eligible cost for each quarter. For both the costs qualifying for CCWIS or non-CCWIS cost allocation, the Title IV-E reimbursement rate is 50%. So for the CCWIS column, the Title IV-E federal financial participation, a lot of F's and P's. So for the CCWIS column, the Title IV-E federal financial participation, or FFP, is half the $8.9 million eligible cost, or $4.5 million. For the non-CCWIS column, 50%, or $540,000, is $270,000. And once again, none of the unique juvenile justice and adult protective services costs are eligible for Title IV-E FFP. Those $200,000 in costs will be allocated to the JJ and adult protective services programs. You can see the difference between the two approaches by comparing the allocated costs in row 2 to the amount of Title IV-E FFP in row 6. For CCWIS, it is half. For non-CCWIS, it is 30%. Because we have limited time, we are not repeating the example for the CCWIS operational cost allocation process. The steps vary somewhat from the process we just discussed. These variations are covered in the instructions and the technical bulletin. Next slide, please. At this point, we will pause to take questions. You may either type your questions on the control panel on the right side of your screen, or you may ask your questions using the phone line. Operator, can you provide instructions for taking questions, please?
Thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. You will be notified to give a response. Again, that is *1 to ask a question.
So after you have determined the appropriate allocation of costs, the next step is to report the costs for reimbursement. Excellent. The costs for each quarter are reported, as are the other Title IV-E costs, on the quarterly CB-496. As you are aware, the Children's Bureau recently updated the CB 496. If you attended the first webinar, the next set of slides will be familiar to you. We reviewed them on February 26th to assist states in completing the Form CB 496 by the March 1st deadline. We are repeating this discussion and also adding a cost claiming example, so you see how to report the costs we derived in our example. To discuss these changes and their impact upon the reporting of CWIS project and non-CWIS project costs, we have Bill Meltzer of the Children's Bureau's Division of Program Implementation. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Laurie. This is Bill Meltzer from the Children's Bureau. The CB 496 report in Part 1 was extensively revised through ACYF Children's Bureau Program Instruction 18-12 for reporting periods that began in federal fiscal year 2019. Today, we're only addressing the changes that impacted on the reporting of Child Welfare Information System technology costs. The version of the CB 496 Foster Care Report in use through federal fiscal year 2018 contains several lines to report in-placement administration. One of those lines, which was the former line 8, is titled as Agency Management, provided for reporting, among other costs, of the allocated share of automated data processing activities not associated with either a SACWIS or a TACWIS or a CWIS project. The revised CB 496 contains a similar reporting line, that's line 7, which is titled as Provider and Agency Management. However, the instructions for this line specify that any directly allocable child welfare automated systems costs must not be reported on this line. These costs, whether associated with a CWIS or a non-CWIS project, should be instead reported on lines 11A to 14B as appropriate in accordance with the instructions provided for those lines. So it is very important that the agency officials responsible for financial reporting be aware that a change must be made in how cost data is compiled and possibly in the agency's cost allocation plan. That could be either, as Laurie mentioned before, a pay cap or a CAM, depending on whether you're a state agency or a tribal agency, to separately identify the non-CWIS information technology costs for Title IV-E reporting purposes. More details on these costs are to be covered shortly. Next slide, please. Information technology costs are now reported on lines 11A through 14B with new breakouts as shown. The biggest change is in the use of reporting using sublines or the CWIS lines where there is an advanced planning document approval number is involved. This is needed to establish the project number to which the costs are associated. Currently, it is possible to have costs for a project numbered either 1, 2, or 3. This number will increase in the coming years. The Children's Bureau Division of State Systems identifies the associated project number on all APD approval documents. We will now review the distinctions for each of these new CB 496 reporting lines. Next slide, please. Lines 11A to 11B cover the non-CWIS project costs which are allocated to Title IV-E foster care that were formerly reported, as I just said before, on the old CB 496 line 8. The costs are now broken out by operational costs and developmental costs. It should be noted that only those costs allocated to Title IV-E foster care program are to be reported on these lines. Therefore, if a non-CWIS project results in costs being allocated to another Title IV-E program, for example, the Adoption Assistance Program, such costs are reported as per instructions for that program. Next slide, please. Here you have a display of how the Excel version of these reporting lines appear. In the online data collection system, where all financial reporting is actually performed, the formatting looks a little bit different. Next slide, please. Lines 12A and 12B both identify CCWIS project operational costs. The difference, however, between the two lines is that since the CCWIS project may consist of some modules that qualify for CCWIS cost allocation, basically meaning no application of a Title IV-E participation rate in allocating the costs are broken out by whether they are for a module using or not using CCWIS cost allocation method. This information is determined in accordance with the guidance as we've been discussing in the CCWIS Technical Bulletin number 5. Next slide, please. Please note that this snapshot shows 3 sublines for each of the 2 reporting lines. The actual OLDC screen in which financial reporting is accomplished only displays 1 subline for each line. Reporting must be done on that subline by identifying a project number for the costs reported. If you need to report costs for more than 1 project number, OLDC through a drop-down will allow you to add the needed rows. The total from each of the sublines will be calculated and displayed in OLDC upon saving or validating the report. It should also be noted that the columns C net prior quarter adjustments, unlike for most other CB 496 reporting lines, are to be entered here in Part 1, showing the breakout by project number and the individual increasing or decreasing prior quarter adjustments for these lines must also be entered in Part 2 of the CB 496 with the appropriate funding category code. OLDC will perform a check to assure that the net total for all project numbers applicable to a particular Part 1 reporting line matches the total entered in Part 2. Next slide, please. Lines 13A and 13B address the CCWIS developmental costs where an APD approval is required. Again, similar to the lines we just spoke about, the breakout is for costs allocated with and without use of the CCWIS cost allocation method. Next slide, please. These are the same subline process for lines 12A and 13A that are now used for 13B. Next slide, please. Line 14A and 14B are for CCWIS developmental costs where an APD approval is not required. Therefore, there is no need to use a project number breakout of the cost. The only breakout on these lines is for the cost allocation method used, CCWIS cost allocation versus non-CCWIS cost allocation method. Line 14A is for reporting costs using the CCWIS cost allocation. Next slide, please. Line 14B, on the other hand, is for reporting any CCWIS developmental costs where an APD is not required using the non-CCWIS cost allocation methodology. Next slide, please. Again, what we have here is a picture of the Excel version. In OLDC, there is only 1 subline for lines 13A and 13B, with more available if needed through the drop-down feature in OLDC, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. Here are all of the new information technology reporting line funding codes that are used in the CB 496 beginning for federal fiscal year 2019, and that includes for any prior quarter adjustments, which we'll talk about in a minute, and which you'd use in Part 2 of the CB 496. Next slide, please. Since there will continue to be prior quarter adjustments, not only for CCWIS and non-CCWIS projects, but also for SACWIS or TACWIS information technology projects, covering costs prior to the CCWIS final rule, this slide shows how the new funding category codes can be used to report such prior quarter adjustments for a SACWIS TACWIS or for a non-CCWIS TACWIS project for periods prior to the creation of a CWIS project in your Title IV agency. Now that we have finished our overview of the revised CB 496, we're going to switch back to discussing the example. David is going to show us how the cost in the example are to be reported on the next slide. Next slide, please, David.
Thank you, Bill. As a reminder, the approved CWIS CAM is applied to all the CWIS project development costs. When you submit the quarterly Form CB 496, it will include all the CWIS costs for that quarter. So, using the development cost allocation example we have discussed, where 89% of the costs qualify for a CWIS cost allocation, 9% qualify for a non-CWIS cost allocation, and 2% of the costs were assigned to the state or tribal programs, all the CWIS and non-CWIS costs would be reported on the CB 496. Because the juvenile justice and adult protective services costs were assigned to the state or tribe, those costs are not reported on the CB 496. And here is a key point. The project costs follow the approved cost allocation, even if your work on CWIS automated functions in a quarter is more or less than the 89% listed in your cost allocation plan. Therefore, for example, even if you only worked on the development of non-CWIS automated functions in a quarter, in other words, 100% of your development work was for non-CWIS components, you would still claim 89% of those costs using the CWIS cost allocation. And then conversely, if in the following quarter your development work was 100% on CWIS automated functions, you would still claim 89% using CWIS cost allocation, 9% using non-CWIS cost allocation, with the remaining 2% allocated wholly to the state or tribe. Having said this, it is important to note that the project cost allocation could change based on additional work or other factors. Next slide, please. And the rows indicated in red are the rows we would use to report the development costs for our example. We are using line 13 because an APD is required for a $10 million project. Assuming this agency has only one CWIS project, the costs allocated using a CWIS cost allocation methodology are reported on the project number 1 subline of line 13A and the non-CWIS costs on the project number 1 subline of line 13B. However, if the agency has more than one CWIS project, each project's costs are listed on separate lines with the corresponding project numbers as applicable. For example, if you are doing some development work to add data exchanges to a transitional CWIS, while simultaneously planning a new CWIS, you would complete more lines as appropriate. This also means you would have different automated function checklists for each project to support each project's cost allocation plan. As a reminder, always follow up with your analyst if you have questions about your project numbers. A final point before we move on. Notice that we are not reporting 100% of the development costs. The 2% allocated to juvenile justice and adult protective services are not reported on the CB 496 because, as we said, those are allocated to the programs. Next slide, please. However, there are two exceptions to the principle that the CWIS cost allocation plan is applied to all project costs. The first exception has to do with planning costs. For example, if you submit a planning APD for a CWIS, all the planning costs for the child welfare share of the system may qualify for CWIS cost allocation. As a reminder, planning APDs are submitted for new projects only, not for a project that has a change in direction or a pause. Likewise, if you have a planning APD for an enterprise system that will include CWIS, the planning costs for the CWIS portion of the enterprise system may qualify for CWIS cost allocation. Planning costs for a new CWIS may qualify for CWIS cost allocation even if the final decision your agency arrives at is not to build a CWIS. However, once the decision is made to go non-CCWIS, none of the costs of the new system or continued planning will qualify for CCWIS cost allocation. Then, if you have additional planning related to new development that is done in later project stages, those activities are described in an as-needed APD or an annual update. These later stage activities taken on after the planning stage do not qualify for this one exception. As always, please discuss the plans for your project with your federal analyst to best determine the type of APD needed. Next slide, please. Now we want to demonstrate how to report the planning APD costs on the CB 496. And we will continue using our cost allocation example using the following assumptions. We will assume that in the current quarter we have $1 million in development costs for our CCWIS project. This is our only CCWIS project, so this number is CCWIS project number 1. And we will also assume that this same project began with a planning APD, and at this time we are reporting a prior quarter adjustment of $100,000 in planning APD costs. Just looking at this slide, you can see how differently the development costs and the planning costs are treated. You can see that visually, there is a 3-line breakout of the $1 million in development costs that follows our cost allocation methodology. But there's only one line under the planning APD costs. So our development costs are allocated according to our approved cost allocation methodology. For this example, this means, once again, that 89% of the costs would be allocated following a CCWIS cost allocation approach, 9% allocated following a non-CCWIS cost allocation approach, and 2% of the programs. However, the $100,000 in planning APD costs are not allocated in the same way. The entire amount, 100%, may be allocated according to the CCWIS cost allocation methodology. We are assuming in this case that we're having a system that is a standalone child welfare system. Next slide, please. And here we see the costs that will be reported on the CB 496. 89% of the development cost, which is $890,000, is allocated according to the CCWIS development cost allocation methodology. This total amount is allocated to Title 4E as reported. For the 9% or $90,000 assigned to the non-CCWIS cost allocation methodology, we first apply our assumed 60% Title 4E participation rate, which results in $54,000 that we will report on the CB 496. The 2% assigned to non-Title 4E programs is not reported, as these costs cannot be allocated to Title 4E. And finally, all of our planning costs, all $100,000 will be reported. Once again, we didn't have to apply our 89-9-2 proportional cost allocation to these costs. This is because the project only included child welfare programs. Next slide, please. And here are the costs on the CB 496. You will notice that all the costs, which are on lines 11A and B, are assigned the same CCWIS project number 1. In our current quarter claims, which are columns A and B, we have the CCWIS development costs. We are bringing these costs forward from the previous slide. We have the $890,000 as CCWIS cost allocation in line 13A with a 15% share of $445,000 listed in column B. The non-CCWIS cost allocation shows up in line 13B. The total that can be allocated to Title 4E, $54,000, is in column A, and the federal share in column B. Then, in the prior quarter adjustment columns C and D, we reflect the APD planning costs. The full $100,000 that may be allocated to Title 4E and the corresponding 50% federal share. These costs must also be reported in Part 2 of the CB 496 as increasing prior quarter adjustments using the appropriate funding category code of CDC. The requirement to report CCWIS prior quarter adjustment costs in both Part 1 and Part 2 of the CB 496 is to assure that the project number identification that's only sought in Part 1 is provided for all the adjustments delineated in Part 2. And notice if you look down to line 13B, there are no costs allocated using non-CCWIS cost allocation for this category of costs. Next slide, please. This highlighted version may make it clearer to you. We have all the development costs, both CCWIS and non-CCWIS, in column A and B, and all planning costs in column C and D. Please note we set this up this way to clearly illustrate the reporting of these planning APD costs as qualifying in their entirety for CCWIS cost allocation. But if the planning costs were current quarter claims, the amounts would instead have been added to line 13A, columns A and B. In other words, you would have added $100,000 to line 13A, column A, and then $50,000 would have been added to line 13A, column B. Next slide, please. The second exception has to do with developing new components of an already completed system. For example, if an agency has an operational system that they are enhancing to meet a specific CCWIS requirement, such as building a mandatory interface or developing a data quality plan, they may request 100% CCWIS funding for that specific effort. Likewise, if an agency is developing a new modular component for the CCWIS, they may request CCWIS or non-CCWIS funding based on the characteristics of that component as we discussed earlier. In other words, if it's not duplicated and consistently used, it may be CCWIS. If it is duplicated or inconsistently used, it would be non-CCWIS. In these cases, the development costs of these 4 E-related tasks may be allocated at the applicable CCWIS or non-CCWIS rate. Non-4E costs would be allocated to the applicable program. We remind you that the development of new automated functions will affect the operational cost allocation because the new automated functions will be added to the automated function checklist, and this updated automated function checklist will affect the operational cost allocation plan. Next slide, please. Since we have finished our review of the CB 496, we will pause to take questions. Next slide, please. We have been talking about developing cost allocation plans and reporting the cost on the CB 496. But when do you need to submit cost allocation plans for the development and operation of IT systems? You need to submit a cost allocation plan when there's a change that affects your cost allocation. Some, and I emphasize some activities that commonly will affect your cost allocation, leading you to submit a new or amended one include when starting a new project. So if you start a new CCWIS project now or anytime in the future, you will need to submit a new cost allocation plan prior to claiming federal financial participation for the system costs. Agencies that decided to transition a system to CCWIS have been provided guidance by their federal analysts, so they know that they needed to update their cost allocation plan to reflect the CCWIS requirements. Whenever you revise the scope of your project, such as adding new automated functions to your checklist, analyze the impact that has upon your cost allocation plan. Or even a change in a function that is already on your list can make a difference. As we noted earlier, you may have an automated function that is duplicated by an external system and therefore does not qualify for CCWIS cost allocation. If your agency decides to decommission the external system so that the CCWIS automated function is no longer duplicated, you will want to amend your cost allocation plan to reflect that a higher percentage of your system qualifies for CCWIS cost allocation. Even adding new programs can have an effect. For example, if you don't make any changes to your system, but you add new programs, and those programs benefit from existing functionality, the benefits must be reallocated to include the new programs. For a more complete list of triggers for submitting cost allocation plan amendments, please see the regulatory citation we have listed here. And the table in section 7 of the cost allocation technical bulletin lists the different triggering events for development versus operational cost allocation plans. Next slide, please. Related to amendments to your cost allocation plan is a column at the far right of the automated function checklist. This is the column your agency checks if this row has been updated since the last time the agency submitted the checklist. As a reminder, the Automated Function Checklist is submitted annually with the APD. So if you have added a new automated function, you will add it to the list, fill in the other columns, and check the update box. You will also check the update box for an automated function that was already on the list if there's a change in that function. For example, you could have a case management module that was duplicated by a child welfare contributing agency system. But in the course of developing your CCWIS, the child welfare contributing agency decommissioned its system and started using the CCWIS. In such a case, you would want to indicate that case management was no longer duplicated and check the update box to flag this change. And if this was the case, you would need to update your cost allocation plan to reclassify the case management function, which had been receiving non-CCWIS cost allocation because it was duplicated, to qualifying for CCWIS cost allocation because the duplication was resolved. So in summary, updating the automated function checklist likely is an indication that you will need to go through the cost allocation steps again. Next slide, please. Throughout this presentation, we have been discussing cost allocation plans. However, as noted at the beginning of the webinar, the plans have different names, and different cost allocation plans are submitted to different agencies. The development cap for state Title IV agencies is referred to as a CAM for cost allocation methodology. This CAM is submitted to ACF in an APD for review by your federal analyst. The operational cap for state agencies is called a Public Assistance Cost Allocation Plan, or PACAP. When you're ready to submit this one, it goes to the department's cost allocation services and to your ACF regional office as well, directly to the RO fiscal staff. If your federal analyst will partner with these two agencies and may assist them in review. For tribal Title IV agencies, the CAPs are known as the Development and the Title IV-E CAM, and both are submitted to ACF. One other point about the CAPs for operations. The CCWIS PACAP for states and the Title IV-E CCWIS CAM for tribes is included as a component or amendment to the larger approved PACAP or operational CAM for the whole program. But don't be confused by these names. They are all cost allocation plans, and the guidance discussed in this presentation and technical bulletin applies to them all. Next slide, please. In summary, here are the main points of the two webinars. As we did in the example that we started in Part 1, complete your automated function checklist first. You will need this data to correctly develop your CCWIS cost allocation plans for both development and operational costs. Recognize that changes in your project will likely result in amendments to your cost allocation plan. For example, if you have a check mark in the update column of the automation function checklist, this is a signal to see if you need to amend your cost allocation plan. The results of applying the cost allocation plan to your budget is reported on the CB 496 for costs that are allocated to Title 40 programs in the appropriate rows and under the correct project number. And when you are allocating costs, remember the allocation applies to the whole project. Next slide, please. Here are links to resources that can provide more details on the topics we covered in both webinars. The Cost Allocation Technical Bulletin. And this is also available as a download from the control panel on the right of your screen. If you don't see the control panel, click on the orange arrow. We have links to the resources on the automated function checklist. The two information memorandum have examples of the optional template we used in this presentation. The template in the first IM is for CCWIS projects under the APD thresholds. The second IM has a template we used. It is the one for above threshold projects. The technical bulletin provides guidance on completing the checklist. We have also provided a link to more information on the Form CB 496. Next slide, please. We also refer to the CAM toolkit, which provides more information on the nuances of cost allocation. We have included this cost allocation program instruction laying out cost allocation as it applies to CCWIS because these cost allocation rules still apply to CCWIS. As we have noted before, the cost allocation rules did not change under CCWIS, although there are now more Title 40 programs you must allocate costs to under the non-CCWIS cost allocation. What is different is determining, through the Automated Function Checklist, what cost allocation methodology, CCWIS or non, applies to which automated functions. And since we refer to the APDs throughout this presentation, we are providing a link to a very comprehensive presentation on APDs. If you are unfamiliar with APDs, this is a good place to start. And even if you need a refresher, this is good as it is so complete. And if you have any questions as you work on your automated function checklist, developing your cost allocation plans, and completing your Form CB-496, please call your federal analyst. You may also submit questions to our CCWIS questions inbox. Next slide, please. This is our final time at which we'll take some questions, and we thank you all again for your attendance and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. At this time, this does conclude today's conference. You may disconnect at this time.